In 2019, this box that looks like a musical instrument case was actually carrying the Lebanese millionaire Carlos Ghosn, who was the CEO of the well-known Japanese company Nissan. How did this millionaire, a man of high social standing, end up in such circumstances? And why was he hiding inside this box, trying to slip past Japanese airport security? Could it really be that an escape plan could succeed so easily? This is an exciting story, filled with success, conspiracies, and a wild escape that seems like it's straight out of a Hollywood movie. So, let's discover the events of this story together. Hello! Before we dive into the story, I want to thank you for the 320 subscribers we've reached in just under 3 weeks. I hope we can keep up this pace to reach 500 subscribers by the end of the week. Without further ado, let's get back to the story of this man named Carlos Ghosn. You may have heard his name over the past few years because his incredible story spread widely. And today, we're going to talk about its fascinating details. Carlos Ghosn, a man of Lebanese descent, holds 3 nationalities: Lebanese, French, and Brazilian. After finishing his studies in France, he got a management position at Michelin, the well-known French tire manufacturer. Carlos kept working hard and succeeded, gradually moving up the ranks until he became the head of Michelin's American division, a very high position. Since Michelin is a French company, it had a strong connection with Renault, the biggest French car company at the time. The CEO of Renault heard about Carlos's success at Michelin, reached out to him, and offered him the position of his deputy at Renault. Carlos accepted the offer and moved to France in 1996 to become the vice president of Renault. At that time, Renault was going through one of its worst periods and was on the brink of bankruptcy. But just 1 year after Carlos arrived, the company experienced a drastic turnaround and returned to profitability, all thanks to Carlos Ghosn's strict management style. When I say strict, I mean it, literally. Carlos's style was all about eliminating any excess or unnecessary expenses in the company. What he did was restructure the company from its roots to its branches. As a result, he closed several factories and laid off thousands of workers and employees, sparking widespread protests in various regions and countries where Renault had factories. The laid-off workers and the French media nicknamed him the cost cutter because his strict style was ruthless, focusing on cutting off loss sources instead of trying to fix them. With this approach, Carlos Ghosn managed to save Renault from its crisis and bring it back better than ever. After this huge success, Carlos wanted to elevate Renault's global standing and make it compete with major companies like Ford, Toyota, and other giants that dominated the global market with their cars. So the idea was to form an alliance with another global company, one with a well-known name worldwide. Carlos Ghosn had his sights set on Nissan, the Japanese company. Even though Nissan was a recognized name, it was also going through a major crisis, even worse than the one Renault faced when Carlos took over. Nissan was in debt by $20 billion, producing over 50 car models, but only 3 of them were profitable while the rest were losing money. Renault, under Carlos Ghosn's leadership, offered to buy a big stake in Nissan to rescue it from its crisis, but this meant that Renault would be the controlling party in Nissan. Now, if you know anything about the Japanese, or don't, let me tell you, they have a lot of pride in their identity and their industries, and under normal circumstances, they would never allow a foreign company like Renault to have the largest share and control their company. But imagine, Nissan was going through such a severe financial crisis that all Japanese banks refused to lend them money. Nissan was already $20 billion in debt, and everyone was waiting for its collapse. No one was willing to take the gamble to help. The only hand extended was that of Carlos Ghosn and Renault. Carlos told them, "Give me just 1 year. and I'll turn the company around and make it profitable. In 3 years, I'll wipe out all the company's debt. And if I don't, I'll resign from my position and retire." Nissan agreed to the offer, and in 1999, Renault bought about 37% of Nissan, making Renault the controlling party of the company. From that point, Carlos Ghosn was appointed CEO of Nissan, a very rare move. There had never been a foreign CEO of such a prestigious and large Japanese company like Nissan. This was a first in the history of Japanese corporations. As soon as Carlos arrived in Japan, he visited all Nissan factories and started inspecting everything in the company, just like he did with Renault when he became vice president. And within just 3 months, Carlos laid out a full plan to save Nissan from its current situation. But the plan was strict in every sense of the word. Carlos shut down 5 Nissan factories and laid off 21,000 workers and employees. Just like before, this led to large protests, with workers demonstrating against losing their jobs, and there were massive public campaigns against the alliance between Nissan and Renault. But it was clear that Carlos Ghosn wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. It didn't stop there. He even started making decisions that went against Japanese traditions and customs. First, he made English the official company language to ensure global success. Second, he stopped the seniority-based promotion system, which was a big part of Japanese corporate culture, and replaced it with a performance-based promotion and rewards system. Of course, that makes sense. Employees shouldn't be rewarded based on how long they've been there, but on how well they perform. But these changes were against Japanese traditions, and this earned Carlos a lot of enemies and haters, even within the board of directors. They were asking, "Who is this foreigner to come in and change everything like this?" But those changes quickly proved successful. Nissan's situation drastically shifted from worse to better. And just like Carlos had previous successes, he achieved massive success with Nissan. As promised, Nissan became profitable again in just 1 year. From there, Carlos Ghosn's reputation in Japan started to shift from the foreign butcher to the foreign savior. People began calling him the man with the magic touch, the guy who could turn any company from loss and failure to profit and success. Carlos Ghosn's name started gaining major fame, not just in Japan, but globally. He was all over the media and won several awards. He even had a manga made about him that sold over 1 million copies. The guy became a star in every sense of the word. It's said that when Carlos Ghosn walks into a restaurant in Japan, people stand up and applaud him. That's how famous and respected he became in society. Years went by, and the numbers for both Nissan and Renault kept growing. In 2005, the CEO of Renault retired, and naturally, his successor was Carlos Ghosn's deputy, who took over as CEO. So now, imagine this. Carlos Ghosn became the CEO of 2 of the largest car companies in the world at the same time, something that had never happened before in history. Of course, this put a lot of pressure on him, and many of those close to him advised him to step down from one of the positions, but he refused and decided to keep going. He wanted to stay the leader of the alliance between the 2 companies that he had built himself. During this time, Carlos Ghosn was making an annual salary of about $17 million. While that wasn't considered outrageous compared to Western CEOs, it was way more than what Japanese CEOs were making. For example, Carlos's salary was 11 times higher than the CEO of Toyota, the biggest car manufacturer in Japan. So, you can imagine the amount of jealousy and anger that many executives in Japan, even at Nissan, felt toward him. There were a lot of people who resented him, even some board members, and this resentment would come into play as events unfolded later. Carlos Ghosn didn't hold back when it came to treating himself. He would throw parties and buy expensive things for himself and his family. He had a yacht worth $10 million, traveled on private jets, drove luxury cars, and lived a lavish lifestyle on the money he earned through his hard work. But this lifestyle was foreign to Japanese customs and traditions. In Japan, even ministers and CEOs don't drive cars. They go to work on bicycles. So, imagine this foreign CEO, making the highest salary, flaunting his wealth in front of everyone. Naturally, Carlos Ghosn had a lot of haters, and that hatred showed its ugly face on November 19, 2018. On this day, Carlos Ghosn had a board meeting at Nissan, and at the time, he was in France, in Paris. He got on his private jet and flew to Tokyo. He said goodbye to his family and wife, boarded the plane. But when the plane landed at Tokyo Airport, he was shocked to find Japanese police waiting for him on the tarmac. As soon as the plane touched down, they surrounded it with their cars, boarded, and arrested him. Carlos asked them, "What's going on? What's happening? Why are you arresting me?" They told him it was about financial corruption. He asked, "What financial corruption? What's the charge exactly?" But no one from the police gave him an answer. They just took him with them and put him in jail. The media in Japan and worldwide started covering the news, and Nissan's stock prices immediately began to plummet. Carlos was sitting in jail, confused about the situation, having no idea what was happening. At the same time, he was expecting Nissan to stand by him, send him a lawyer, and defend him against the charges. But instead, he was shocked to find out that the company's board had appointed one of their own as interim CEO. This new CEO held a press conference and told the public, "After conducting an internal investigation with the help of authorities, we discovered significant financial and administrative corruption caused by our CEO, Carlos Ghosn. As a result, we have decided to dismiss him from his position immediately." Carlos Ghosn was shocked by what was happening. He didn't expect this kind of betrayal and backstabbing from his company's board. He kept denying the charges, insisting that all the accusations against him were false. The main charges were that he didn't declare the payments made to him by the company. Basically, if he didn't declare the money he received, it meant he wouldn't pay the appropriate taxes on it, and they considered that tax evasion. But Carlos Ghosn's salary from the company had been reported to the authorities. The loophole was that they claimed Carlos was planning to set up a retirement fund worth millions of dollars, and that was true. He was planning on getting a big retirement payout after retiring, and the company's board was fully aware of this plan, as they were the ones who would decide the amount in the first place. Suddenly, the Japanese authorities came and asked Carlos, "Why didn't you declare this amount?" He replied, "The amount hasn't even been determined yet, and I'll get it in the future after I retire. I haven't received it yet, so how can I declare it?" But the Japanese authorities insisted, saying, "No, this is financial fraud." The whole case was weird from the start, and the charges seemed fabricated. What was also surprising was how the authorities treated Carlos Ghosn. Imagine, they put him in solitary confinement for 3 months in a high-security prison called Kosuge Prison. A prisoner who wasn't charged with a violent crime or murder, yet he was placed in solitary confinement, in a tiny cell for 3 months. Why? During those 3 months, it was becoming clear that Nissan's board was running a campaign to destroy Carlos's reputation, especially in the eyes of the public. They accused him of buying houses and apartments in Paris, Beirut, and Brazil at the company's expense. But Carlos said these apartments and houses were well known to the board, and he used them for work purposes, as his position as the CEO of 2 companies required him to constantly travel. Plus, the ownership of these homes belonged to the company, not to him personally. Another charge fabricated against him was about a party he threw to celebrate 15 years of the Renault-Nissan alliance. But this party happened to coincide with Carlos's birthday, and the company spent over $700,000 on the event, which was held at the Palace of Versailles in France, in the style of a 17th-century royal celebration. Now, the company is asking, was this a party for the alliance, or was it Carlos's birthday party? Maybe Carlos did combine the two events, but the party wasn't some secret scheme or embezzlement of money. So why didn't the board object to the party back then, and only bring it up now? It was obvious that they were trying to pile up as many charges as they could against Carlos Ghosn. But why? Why did Nissan's board turn on him after 19 years of him leading the company? The reason was that the French government had taken a large stake in Renault, and this caused some concern that the French government might push for a full merger between the two companies. So, the idea was no longer just an alliance. It meant the two companies would merge into one, and that probably meant the Nissan name would disappear, leaving only Renault. And like we said, the Japanese have a deep pride and connection to their identity, so this was a red line for them. They felt the best move was to get rid of the key figure, the main person in the company, the only one who could make this merger happen and succeed. And of course, that person was Carlos Ghosn. Even though Carlos himself was against this idea and wanted both companies to keep their independent identities, the Japanese saw him as the main threat. That's probably why they acted this way and fabricated the case against him. Overnight, they turned him from the hero who saved the company into the corrupt villain, not just in Japan but even in France, where his image was completely tarnished in front of the public. The strange thing here is that the French government, which was supposed to defend him in this situation, stayed silent. Even Renault, the company he saved as its CEO, didn't take any action, as if there was suddenly a global conspiracy against him. During this time, Carlos was still in jail, and the prosecutor's office didn't have any solid evidence against him, so they were trying to get a confession from him by any means. They constantly interrogated him, and sometimes the sessions would go on for 14 hours straight, even without a lawyer present. They threatened him, saying, "If you don't confess, things will get even harder for you, and we'll dig deeper and find things against you, maybe even involving your wife and kids." They were openly threatening his family. They used isolation in solitary confinement and intense pressure during the interrogations, trying to force a confession out of him in any way, like they were literally holding him hostage. But Carlos stood firm and denied all the charges throughout the 3 months he was in jail. Finally, after 3 months in solitary confinement, a Tokyo court granted him bail. But imagine this, the bail was set at 2 billion yen, about $9 million. Of course, Carlos paid it because he could afford it, and he had no other choice. Carlos was released from jail with heavy media coverage, and helicopters followed his car all the way to his apartment. It was impossible to hide his location from the press. The situation outside his apartment was chaotic for weeks. Carlos and his wife couldn't move freely because journalists were surrounding them everywhere. It was hard even to reach their car. During this time, Carlos Ghosn was organizing his papers and gathering information. He also tweeted, saying he would hold a press conference on April 11th, where he would reveal all the truths about what was happening. He was planning to speak out to the public and expose the conspiracy against him. But less than 24 hours after posting that tweet, the Japanese authorities surrounded his apartment and arrested him again. They were afraid he might speak out. Imagine, they arrested him again, even though he had already paid bail. But Carlos and his lawyer had anticipated this possibility, so they recorded a video as a backup message for the press conference in case he got arrested.
If you are listening to me through this video today, it means that I was not able to make the press conference. The first message is I'm innocent. This is a conspiracy. This is not about specific events. This is not about greed. This is about a plot. This is about conspiracies. This is about backstabbing. That's what we're talking about.
And that's exactly what happened. After the second arrest, Carlos was held for another 21 days before being released on bail again. This time, he paid about $5 million, so he ended up paying a total of $14 million in bail. And imagine, the authorities put some really strange conditions on him. The first condition was that they would confiscate his Lebanese and Brazilian passports, leaving him only his French passport as a form of ID. The second condition, which was obvious, was that he was banned from leaving Japan and had to stay in the country. The third condition was that they would confiscate his personal devices, like his laptop and phone. The fourth and weirdest condition was that he wasn't allowed to contact his wife or family at all. Even if he tried to send a message or an email to his wife, it would be a violation of his bail conditions, and they'd arrest him again immediately. They banned him from seeing his wife and family. I mean, who in their right mind makes rules like that? It was clear they wanted to break him down so he'd confess, because they knew his wife was one of the main pillars of support for him. Without her, they thought he'd weaken and maybe break more easily. When Carlos heard about these conditions, he knew the Japanese authorities meant serious harm, so he asked his lawyer to tell his wife to go back to Beirut. He wanted to get his family and loved ones out of that place, because he realized he wasn't going to get justice there. Also, the biggest problem in Japan is that the prosecutor's success rate is 99.4%, which is just a ridiculous and insane figure. It basically means winning a case against the prosecutor is nearly impossible, and he would be convicted one way or another. When it became clear to Carlos that getting a fair trial there was out of the question, he started thinking about escaping the country. Carlos, after being released on bail, was staying in one of his houses in Japan, and he was supposed to wait for his trial, but he was free to move around within Japan. So the first step he needed to take to begin planning his escape was getting a phone. And he did. He paid a large sum to get a phone without any paperwork, a phone the Japanese authorities wouldn't know was his. And imagine, every call he made was in the bathroom with the water running, because he wanted to be sure that even if there was a bug outside the house, they wouldn't be able to hear the conversation. The question here is, who were the people Carlos Ghosn contacted? Who helped him escape? This hasn't been revealed because if their identities were exposed, it could put them in danger or under investigation. So, Carlos has never talked about them. The important thing we know is that Carlos had a team helping him plan this operation, and the team was probably made up of about 10 to 15 people. The initial idea they had was to smuggle Carlos out by sea, but traveling by sea, especially to a country like Lebanon, would take too long, so the second option they had was to escape by air. But of course, the problem was that Carlos was banned from traveling and leaving Japan. So how could he get on a plane without being stopped by airport security and having his travel documents checked? That's where the actual plan started. The escape team helping Carlos did a lot of research at various airports in Japan. They went in and out of multiple airports, studying the security procedures. They took lots of flights back and forth until they noticed that security was very tight at some airports, like Tokyo's, but they found a serious loophole at another airport, Osaka's. This airport was small and quiet, and the team noticed that large boxes weren't being scanned by X-ray machines. For example, boxes used to transport musical instruments. The X-ray machine at this airport was designed for scanning luggage, but these boxes were too big to fit through the machine. That's when the crazy, bold idea came up: to smuggle Carlos Ghosn inside one of these boxes. The plan was for two people to pose as a band and fly to Tokyo on a private jet. The plane would carry their boxes and musical instruments. They'd enter this airport, claiming they were performing at a concert in Tokyo, and right after, they'd have another concert in Istanbul, meaning their entry and exit from Japan would be quick on the same day. These two guys were a former U.S. Special Forces soldier named Michael Taylor, and the second was named George Zayek, who apparently was also a former soldier from Lebanon. These two would play the role of the musicians who would smuggle Carlos Ghosn out of Japan. The idea was insane, and even Carlos himself was hesitant at first. But after going over the calculations and reviewing his options, he realized he had no other choice but to try. The problem was that Carlos's house was under surveillance. And although he was free to move within Japan, leaving for a long trip to Osaka would raise suspicion. Carlos could even see some people who were clearly from the Japanese authorities spread out around his house, watching him. So he asked his lawyer, "Do they have the legal right to watch me like this?" The lawyer responded, "They don't, but we can't prove it." So Carlos asked, "Okay, what's the solution?" And his lawyer told him, "We can call in some scandal-hungry journalists and let them know what's happening. That might confuse the authorities, and maybe they'll stop the surveillance." So Carlos reached out to some journalists and newspapers, and when the reporters showed up, Carlos noticed that the informants and surveillance guys disappeared immediately. If the journalists had discovered them, it would have been a huge scandal for the authorities. When the reporters arrived, they didn't find anyone surveilling the place, and after waiting around for a few hours, they left. But soon after, Carlos noticed the watchers coming back. He could see them sitting in their black cars or standing in the street in front of the house. But now at least he knew that if he ever needed to distract them, all he had to do was call the journalists, and the watchers would disappear immediately. Eventually, the escape team set December 29, 2019, as the date for the escape plan. But there was an additional problem. Carlos was famous in Japan, and to make matters worse, his foreign features stood out, especially since there's a huge difference between Japanese, Arab, and European facial features. He'd draw attention instantly, but luckily for them, it was the end of the year and the weather was cold. So Carlos wore a big coat, a winter hat, and a medical mask on his face. It was normal for Japanese people to wear medical masks in winter, even before the COVID pandemic, which allowed Carlos to easily hide his features in the cold. Right after that, he called the journalists and told them the watchers were around his house and promised they'd catch them this time. But as always, news reached the watchers immediately, and they knew the journalists were coming, so they left before they showed up. Once Carlos noticed they had disappeared, he casually walked out of the house, wearing the clothes that hid his appearance. He then headed to the Grand Hyatt Hotel, where he met the two guys helping him with the escape, Mike Taylor and George Zayek. They advised him to stay calm and not draw any attention. After that, they left the hotel and took a taxi to the train station, where they boarded the bullet train to Osaka. When they arrived in Osaka, they headed to another hotel. In that hotel, the box that would be used to smuggle Carlos out was waiting for them. They tested the box to make sure Carlos could breathe inside, and they eventually made a few small holes to ensure proper airflow. Then Carlos took off his clothes, put on something light, and got inside the box, which they then covered with a white sheet so no one would notice if it was opened by mistake. After that, they closed the box and called the hotel staff to carry it down to the basement. The two men helping Carlos asked the staff to be careful since the box contained an expensive, sensitive musical instrument. Then they loaded the box into a truck, which also contained another similar box. But this second box really did contain musical equipment. The truck headed to the airport, and when they arrived, The two men unloaded both boxes and started moving them toward customs. Carlos was inside the box, hearing Japanese voices from outside. After a while, he felt the box move, and he realized they'd reached the customs checkpoint. Carlos heard one of the men helping him talking to the customs officers, saying, "The concert went really well. Thanks for your cooperation and the help you gave us." Keep in mind, these two men had entered the same airport earlier that day and passed through customs under the pretense of being a band headed to Tokyo for a concert. Now they were leaving Japan after the concert. Of course, the customs officers started asking about the contents of the boxes. The two men told them they were carrying musical instruments and explained that the box had been inspected earlier that morning when they arrived. Now they were carrying their boxes and instruments after finishing their concert in Tokyo, heading straight to their next performance in Istanbul on their private plane. This wasn't out of the ordinary, especially since it was the end of the year, which is a busy time for concerts. The guy helping Carlos told customs, "Please handle these boxes carefully. The instruments inside are very delicate, and if they're handled roughly, their sound could be ruined, and we've got another concert in Istanbul right after this." The customs officers didn't think much of it. Since they had already scanned the boxes earlier that morning when they arrived, and now they were leaving, there was no need to double-check. Especially since these guys were traveling on a private plane, and there was nothing suspicious about them. While Carlos was inside the box, he overheard two customs officers joking with each other, saying these two guys were probably smuggling girls inside the boxes. And that was it. They didn't search the boxes or even try to open them. All they did was scan the suitcases with the X-ray machine and then pass the boxes through. Carlos himself says the plan wasn't supposed to work, but things just strangely fell into place. And they were also helped by the circumstances, since they went at the end of the year. At that time, there were fewer staff because many of them were on vacation, meaning the workload was higher, and usually the more experienced staff were the ones on vacation. This also worked in their favor because the officers on duty were less experienced. With that, the team left the airport with their boxes and loaded them onto their private plane. Carlos had to stay inside the box until the plane took off, so he waited anxiously for about half an hour, fearful that something might happen or he'd get caught. But finally, he heard the plane start to move down the runway, and soon after, he felt the moment of takeoff. Finally, he could take a deep breath, knowing they had left Japan. One of the men who was helping him came over, opened the box, and sat with him in the back room of the plane, which was closed off. This guy was the one who brought him water and food. Finally, the plane landed at Istanbul airport, and a new person came to take Carlos off the plane without entering the airport. He was transferred to another plane waiting for him on the runway. This plane was headed to Beirut, and the flight was short, only about an hour. As soon as Carlos got off the plane, the customs officer recognized him right away. Of course, in Lebanon, Carlos Ghosn's name was very well known, and the Lebanese people had been supporting him since the beginning of his case. They even had banners in the streets to support him. So when the customs officer saw him, he welcomed him and congratulated him on arriving in Lebanon. And finally, Carlos Ghosn knew he was safe. Carlos reunited with his wife and family, and right after, the news of his escape from Japan spread incredibly fast worldwide. The Japanese authorities and media were shocked by the whole thing, and Carlos Ghosn's lawyers were accused of negligence for not monitoring him properly, even though that wasn't their job. The Japanese authorities issued an arrest warrant for Carlos Ghosn through Interpol, which is the international police organization. But Lebanon is one of the countries that doesn't extradite its citizens to any other country, and it was clear their stance would be to protect Carlos. Of course, Carlos then held a big press conference in Beirut, stepped in front of the world and the public, and explained what had happened. giving a very strong defense for himself, revealing all the details and information he had. In the end, he openly said that he didn't escape from justice, but rather escaped from the lack of justice. Since then, Carlos Ghosn has appeared in many interviews on well-known Arabic and foreign channels. He also appeared in a documentary film where he openly discussed all the details of his case. The only thing he was reserved about was the escape operation, because he knew if he revealed all the details, the people who helped him could get into trouble. The Lebanese authorities offered the Japanese authorities the case files and proposed to try Carlos Ghosn in Lebanese courts, but the Japanese authorities refused, and to this day, they still demand that Carlos Ghosn be handed over to them. Carlos still lives in Lebanon to this day, and the case against him remains active on the Japanese side. He's still at great risk of being arrested if he leaves Lebanon due to the arrest warrant issued by Japan through Interpol. And imagine, even the French legal system issued an arrest warrant for him after conducting their own internal investigations into Renault. But, on the surface, so far, no solid evidence has come to light that proves these charges against Carlos Ghosn. On the contrary, the man has always appeared and spoken about his case openly, unlike the Japanese legal system, which has handled the case with extreme stubbornness and arrogance, confirming its bad intentions at every turn. But in any case, it's impossible to know the full truth unless all the facts come to light one day. Until that day comes, we've reached the end of our story. So don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. And here are some awesome clips you can check out. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye.